Hey everyone, welcome to a conversation with Donna, currently head of the Inly School. And I hear there's a story about that, so we'll get into it. Today, we're going to have a conversation around the past, the present, and the future of how Inly began, sort of the evolution to where it got to today, and some of the ways that Donna's thinking about growing over the next couple of years and certainly beyond to continue to add great value to the way that our kids learn. My name is Barrett King. I'm actually going to be the host today and have a conversation with Donna. My son actually goes to the school, so I'm quite intimately familiar. And then selfishly, I'm excited to have this conversation with you, Donna, because frankly, I myself don't know this story. So welcome to the chat. I'm really excited to have a conversation today.
Thanks. So am I. Thanks for inviting me today.
Yeah, my pleasure. Absolutely. All right. So let's kick off with certainly some history. I think that's a good place to start. Let's talk about how the school began, sort of the story of the founders and where this whole journey kicked off.
Absolutely. There were two couples, the Terranovas and the Calendars, both of whom had small houses here in Situate and a good bit of property. They were real idealists in the early 70s, thinking that there's something more to education than kids sitting behind desks and sort of a factory model of let's all learn the same thing at the same time on the same day. And they had studied Montessori and thought, let's bring it to the South Shore. And they did. They started with about 20 students in the wing of one of their houses here, right on which is now our property, and began a very, very successful journey to building what is now Inly School. We did start out as the Montessori Community School, and changed the name, I think about 20 years ago now.
It's so interesting. And so when they were conceptualizing this, right, it sounds like it was based off of perhaps their own wants or likes or needs for their own children to have this educational opportunity. What drew you to the school? What brought you here early on?
So I was actually working in the arts and working at some of the schools locally. Uh, Thought because I love looking at the big picture, that it would be interesting to head a school. I thought I'll start with a small school and was lucky enough to land this job. What I realized, and I think what our founders really intended, was that this education is something that's has deep respect for children, and is built on a multi-age platform. So children are together in developmental stages. As someone that had worked in the arts for years, I was one of those people that worked with groups of kids in at a variety of different ages, and so it resonated with me. I understood that deeply in my early career, that younger kids could learn from older kids and they could be role models, and it wasn't just the teacher all the time delivering, but actually the children are teachers within the classroom. And so, as it resonated with me, I thought this is a job I really want to have, and have been delighted to be here now for 27 years.
That's so impressive. So what I'm picturing is like two families, sitting across perhaps a kitchen table, looking at each other saying, we want something different, something more for our children. Do you have any insights? I'm really curious into, we're talking earliest of days, but was there like I'm almost picturing like a charter for some reason, like a poster on a wall. It's like, here's our values, here's our goals. Like, was there some sort of a framework that the founders themselves and those early families, and I would imagine based on what you're describing, the early students set out as a way that they would, sort of frame in, how are we going to educate? How are we going? What are our values? What's important to us as a school and as a community as we build this really great place?
Yes, I think that what was their founding principle was Maria Montessori's work, which started in the early 1900s, and didn't come to the States until the 60s. It was really based in Italy, and she did some work in India, actually. And so once they discovered that, that was the foundational piece that our founders wanted to bring here. But Montessori, as I said, was very, very new, 60s, early 70s here in the States. Not many people heard about it. Most people thought it was like really odd and unusual because the kids are given a balance of independence and understanding of learning responsibility. And in those days in particular, and I think sometimes now, people don't really trust kids. They don't trust that they're naturally curious, which we do. We think kids really want to learn and they really want to grow and they really want to explore. And it's our job as educators to set up an environment that invites them in to do that natural exploration that kids will do. So I think they were intrigued by that premise, and that's still our foundation today. Is we believe in, as I said earlier, multi age classrooms. We believe that children should be respected as young people that want to grow and learn and are naturally curious.
That's great. So I'm hearing a lot of like trust, a lot of understanding and patience, certainly. So let's imagine that I'm a parent. I'm listening to this conversation, and I'm sitting there saying, "Well, I've heard the word Montessori. Conceptually, I understand. Like, I know why Inly is interesting. Perhaps, what if you were to ground the person listening to this into maybe like two or three sentences on Montessori as a methodology and why, and I think most importantly, how it's valuable to their student? Can you do that for us? Like, give us a framework to operate within in terms of the Montessori concept."
Sure. I think Montessori, in every way, respects individuals and helps them discover and grow to their potential and gives them the self confidence and willingness. I think our kids love to learn. So all of those pieces come together in a way that helps shape the individual. So our kids don't compete with each other necessarily. They compete with themselves. I did this last time and I'd like to do this much work the next time or learn this much more the next time. So it becomes that intrinsic motivation.
Yeah, it's interesting. The idea of self motivation, to your point, and then the sort of ability, the freedom. It sounds like where I'm picturing, because I'm an analogies person. So like I'm picturing, we're all set on the highway, if you will, together. We're driving down the road, but our guardrails, are sort of set in a way that allows us to navigate different lanes and get on and off the highway whenever we need to. We're not stuck in one lane at one speed in one direction, et cetera. We get the freedom to drive our vehicle. But again, there's some guardrails, there's a bit of a framework so that we learn and we grow within a certain sort of direction. That's a lot of what I'm hearing you say.
That's absolutely correct. And I think over time, we actually end up building our own cars, which surround us and keep us going. That's the gift, I think, is that understanding that who am I question is a huge byproduct of this work. Our kids really understand themselves as people, as learners, as humans, as people in relationships with teachers, with their families, with their classmates, etc., built on this framework.
I love that. So again, I mean, I love the analogy. So I'm picturing like building a really cool car right now, and how every student gets to build their own.
And paint their own and design their own car. And it's really, I think, a gift that's a lifelong gift. It stays with them forever because they know they have the power to do that.
Yeah, that's magical. I've even met people. I'm 38 for reference sake for folks listening, but like I've met people in my age group that have said, oh, I was a Montessori kid, and there's a difference. There's an absolute difference in terms of, to your point, comfortability, confidence, ability to have interpersonal relationships and connect with their peers. So I feel like you're changing the world one student at a time.
We hope we are. And we certainly hear that from the high schools and colleges that our kids go to after graduation, that they are the kids that see the big picture and can go to a head of school without hesitation because they talk easily with adults and say, I notice you don't have such and such a club. I'd like to start one. Can you, give me the power to do so? That kind of thing, which is, self-advocacy and using their will and imagination to create something new. And they believe they can.
That's awesome. So I'm hearing you talk about this and thinking a lot about where it was. So you said started in, I wrote this down, I think 1973. Is that right? Okay.
That's correct. Yeah, we're in our 50th year, which is a real gift. And as we said before, it started as a very small place in one wing of the one of the houses, and then they just started building on their property. So one classroom at a time. It was sort of like a good old New England farmhouse. They'd attach one and then the next, and they'd negotiate. If you're a plumber, I'll give you free tuition if you'll add two bathrooms to this new thing that we're putting in on the school. And it was a good old fashioned, let's build this and we know they'll come. And it happened. Yeah.
It's so great. Yep. And now, I mean, so now I don't want to skip the middle. We're going to go back to it. But now, how many students are at the school? Back from a few in the beginning to how many now?
340 students, yeah. And so, yeah, when I started which was 27 years ago, we had 140 students on 3 acres. Now we have 340 on 14 acres. So we've purchased most of the property around, renovated, built a variety of things over time.
And so during that growth, then you've had everything from I'm sure more students, obviously more property. How has the framework of how the students learn? Maybe it's in depth or width, but how is the evolution of Inly as a school in terms of size, to your description, and scale? How has that changed the way that the students themselves have an opportunity to learn? Like, have you added more classes? Have you added more curriculum? How has the actual evolution of the program itself gone over the last 27 years you've been here?
Um, I would say we've always kept the Montessori foundation, which is really important to know. That is what drives us every day. However, we also know that Maria Montessori died in the 1950s. Lots has happened in the world and in the world of education since then. So what we're very diligent about is saying, let's look at a new reading program. Let's make sure it matches our Montessori beliefs and foundations, and say, will that match or not? And can we embed that and integrate it in meaningful ways into our school? So we've looked at every piece of our work, all of our curriculum, to say, how do we help our kids, right? And because the kids and their families are at the center of all of the decisions we make here. Over time, keeping that as a central piece, we've added what we call Montessori Plus. And as I said, Maria died a long time ago. However, I think her aspirations live on. And for Montessori Plus, we are particular about describing what those pluses are and how they integrate with who we are. So keeping Montessori at the center, we certainly look at experiential learning. What is it that when our students go on field studies and learn beyond the four walls of their classroom, what does that mean? What does that look like? And how do we make that authentic? We look at their social emotional well-being every day in every way. We understand that kids need to feel happy, comfortable with themselves, and engaged to learn. Which is great. We've got a huge arts and athletics program here, again, meshed into and integrated with the work that we do. And we have a huge innovation and imagination program that we teach very specifically to enhance what we call our comprehensive academic program.
So in that framework, then, are there challenges that you've experienced over the last 27 years in terms of whether that's adoption or the way that I would say prospective students, but I think more importantly, parents, to your point, receive and understand the model? Or do you see that people look at it and say, well, that makes sense, and they just sort of dive in head first?
I think we have all kinds of parents, so we have all those reactions and more. I would say that the parents that come to us are people that say, like our founders, I think education can be more than sitting behind a desk and someone opening up my head and dumping information in and saying, okay, let's see how that turns out. Instead, we contextualize things for kids, and we help them really understand that you can get all kinds of content in many different places, but it's more than just understanding content. It's really becoming a thinker about that content, and how do I take that in? How do I match that content with my ethical understanding of the world and make sense of it, and then understand my own position within something. And that's a long process. That doesn't happen to a 7-year-old magically on a Tuesday, right? It happens over time. And we scaffold that very, very conscientiously so that by the time our kids graduate from 8th grade, they really understand themselves and themselves in the context of the world and what their understanding of the world is, and their goals for. Um, I think it goes beyond the question people used to ask me when I was a kid, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I think it goes sort of, what do you want to do? What kind of human are you going to be in the world? So it's a broader question that we ask our kids today, and I think Inly kids are able to answer that question really well.
It's an important one. It's maybe selfish when I say this, but whenever I'm in tech, right, and so I advise a lot of companies, and I'm fortunate to mentor some really great younger and so I guess in some ways also older in their career folks, and they always say to me like, "Well, how did you know what you wanted to do next?" That description you gave of like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I always ground it in. It's very similar to what you're describing. What kind of work do you want to do, and who do you want to do it with? Those are the two questions you should ask. If you can answer those, I want to do X around these kinds of people or this kind of, you know, um, a knowledge set or whatever it might be, then you can go find the job. Like the job will, evolve in some capacity and you'll find it. What I'm hearing you say is at, 5, 6, 8, 10 years old, you're giving students the tools to make similar decisions. What type of life do I want to have? How do I want to exist in the world? And I'm sure in some capacity, obviously, what kind of work do I want to do? But not what do I want to be? Like, do I need to be a doctor or a lawyer and label it in some capacity? What kind of human do I want to exist as? It's so fascinating.
It is, and I think again, it's like the ability to design your own car, right? It's the gift that will propel them into the future because they will have the power to do that. And we know that kids that are graduating college today will have 12 significant jobs in their lives, right? In five different careers, and four of the five careers don't exist yet. So I think it's not a valid point to say, what do you want to be when you grow up? Because we don't even know what the future is going to look like. So it's our job as educators to ask the bigger questions, as you're talking about, to say, do you want to work on a team? How do you collaborate? Are you good at collaboration? Can you lead a team? Can you step back and be part of the team when that's part of your job, and so on? And we give our kids all of those opportunities so that they can help understand who they might want to be in the world.
And do it young. I mean, that's the part that I think is fascinating to me, and it's part of what I mean to tell my own story. But part of what drew Jen, my wife, and myself to the school was quite literally driving past and seeing a sign and saying, "Well, what is that? That looks interesting." And the fun cows and the really great campus, and we Googled the school and saw that the sort of cornerstone of it was the ideological thinking, this concept of giving students the empowerment to be. We always sort of joke a little bit because our son, his name's Ethan. I'll say his first name. Um, he's almost 4, but he presents like a 6-year-old, and he's always been a little bit advanced in that sense. And yet, he's gone to the school now, and watching him flourish into not just a creative player, which I think is valuable, the way he's more adept at taking objects and toys and such and creating little worlds, but that he's, to your point, I think you made it earlier, most importantly, around confident in asking for things, confident and deliberate in advocating for himself. And I think about even just my wife and I and ourselves and the way that we've evolved in the world. It took us until much later in life, even for me personally, like after college is somewhere around the time where I started to figure out my voice. Whereas now these students in particular, and I'm so just drawn to your statement of like 4 out of the 5 careers that they'll pass through don't exist today. Even just thinking about, I'm kind of a tech geek, if you will, but like the advent of AI and the advent of some of these technologies that will certainly eclipse a lot of our own knowledge today very quickly. Now you're preparing students for how they can exist in the world, not how do they answer the question on a test. So it's so much more than creative thinking. It's so much more than, again, this framework that we're talking about. They are literally learning to build cars that they then get in and drive in that sense, which is just fascinating to me. And so I want to talk about that for a second. So early on, you come to the school, you've got 150 some odd students, things are working. What do you do first? Like, do you see what's working and absorb it for a year or two and then start to shift things? Because we're going to get into in a couple minutes here the future, where you want to go. But I want to frame out a little bit more tightly where you've been in terms of what are some of the changes that you've made beyond curriculum, just in terms of being, here for 27 years and having that exposure to see what worked. And then most importantly, I think set vision for how we need to evolve to meet those growing needs of students of the future.
Thanks. I think there were a few strategies that were pivotal in our growth. In particular, one, of course, is keeping Montessori as the foundation of who we are. So that it is absolutely the driver of the school. And as we had talked about earlier, was really looking at our curriculum and saying, how do we make the curriculum work through middle school? Montessori did most of her work in preschool. And so many people have that in their minds that Montessori is just a preschool because many of them around the world are just preschools. Our founders wanted to see it grow up with children, and I think it was my job to figure out how to articulate that. How, because Montessori and her son wrote a 3-page paper on what a middle school might look like. And so our early middle school was tiny, tiny, tiny. And I knew that kids need peers, they need a cohort, they need to learn to work collaboratively and so on. So I figured out how to build a curriculum and use Montessori. And as I said before, define what that Montessori Plus is so that we were giving a rich curriculum. So that was number one. Number two was changing the name of the school. We were the Montessori Community School, and it was an interesting thing. Parent told me after March break years ago that they were sitting with their son on a beach someplace in March break, and an elderly gentleman sat beside their son, whose name is Colton, and said, just struck up a conversation with Colton, who was in 7th grade at the time, had been here since preschool, loved the school. And when this gentleman asked, where do you go to school? Colton said, Springfield Academy. Now, there's not a Springfield Academy here in Massachusetts that I know of. And he made it up. And his parents sort of let it go until the gentleman left and said, okay, Colton, what's up? You love your school. He said, I can't tell anyone I go to a Montessori school. Montessori is for babies. And so, for one of our graduates to think that way, I went to the board and said, we've talked about a name change, but we really have to be serious about this if we want to grow and if we want our kids to be loud and proud about the school that they go to. So we, went into a year-long, committees, right? A year-long search for a great name for our school. We knew parameters. We wanted it to be short. We wanted it to be ours. We didn't want anyone to come in with a preconceived notion of what it might be. And we finally, really truly after a year, came up with the name Inly. It's actually an Old English word that means deep thought and understanding. It's from Dickens' time. And it's not used any longer. And we loved it partly because it's a great word to brand for ourselves, but also we love education around in words. So we use lots of in words as we describe ourselves. So it's been a double hit, I think, for us.
It's so interesting because I don't. It's funny. You and I have had hundreds of conversations at this point, and I've never asked you where the name came from, and I feel like there's something just truly valuable around that story because it shows the care and the love and the intent that you put behind naming it. If Colton, if you're listening to this, like, thank you for misnaming and avoiding the school because it's got a great resonance kind of right now. I'm interested in thinking about how that continues to frame out today. So like when you think about, to your point, a deep learning, understanding the concepts of what the word means, how does that permeate the entire system that you've built around how you help students? You mentioned like we use a lot of in words. What other ways does the term Inly, the word Inly, the brand, if you will, show up in the way that students experience the school?
So actually, it goes back to something that you said earlier that we'd come back to. When I was asked in my initial introduction to parents, so this was 27 years ago, they had a party and invited me to meet folks. One of the parents said, what would you like to be called? And, sometimes people are called the principal or the director. And I said, if I had my way, I would like to be called the head and the heart of a school, not just the head of school, because the head of school is more traditional, right? But I do see that as my role, because I think that children learn better when they feel emotionally cared for, when they feel like they're embraced and loved, metaphorically, and symbolically every day in every way. When they feel that kind of safety, they can learn. And as a matter of fact, there's joy in learning when that happens because they're comfortable in themselves. So I think that that's been a driving force for me is the thinking about the curriculum and so on, but also creating a community where kids feel they belong, where they feel loved, cared for, and it's sort of an extension of their homes, their families, and the people that embrace and love them every day.
Is it worth highlighting then? That's such a good thing to talk about because even in my own experience, the school itself is very welcoming to the students, but I think also to the parents in many ways. I remember early on in our admissions journey when we were exploring the school, hearing folks talk about, even ask questions directly of us. Like, how do you think about being involved? Are you interested in taking part? And in just the last, whatever it's been now, first quarter, if you will, that he's been a part of the school, there's so many opportunities to be involved. I'm curious how over your time here, the community outside the support system around the Inly has evolved. And I'm curious of the trends that you're seeing in terms of like, do you see a shift? I'm sure you do in the way that students learn. You described it earlier of, the amount of work that they'll do that doesn't exist today, the amount of careers and jobs and such. But how is the way that parents and caregivers and the people that love these students, how has that evolved and changed as you've grown the school?
So I think it's evolved. I don't think it's changed so much. I think we just keep offering opportunities for folks because I deeply believe education is a partnership. It doesn't stop at 3:20 when kids leave school, right? It's got to be an extension of the ways in which we talk with children, the ways in which they learn, and excuse me, the ways in which we sort of approach and converse every day in every way. So, inviting folks into the classroom, into the school, into our community meetings and gatherings and so on, so that children know this is an extension of their family. I think is really important to give them that strong foundation in feeling like they belong. I think that that's a yearning for humans, right? So we try to do that and involve folks every way we can. I also know that people work today. I mean, it's the world has changed significantly since certainly when I went to school, and my mom could stay home and bake cookies and have things for us every afternoon. Parents and caregivers are very, very busy. I think the demands of life now are just busier. So for us to create a community where everyone wants to gather and be together on behalf of our children, I think is a real hallmark here and one that will serve our children well as they, as you were talking about earlier, sort of say, this is the life I want to lead. This is the human I want to be. This is the family I want to create. This is the work situation I want to be involved in. It's going to inform all of that.
That's fascinating too, because it's actually, let's talk about that. So, where does it go from here? Let's talk about the future for a second. And there's, I want to give you complete freedom and carte blanche to say, like, there's a blank piece of paper in front of us. We have a Sharpie perhaps, and we can draw on it in that sense. But what what is the future of career, of job? And we're going to talk about education. I want to talk about how Inly reinforces and supports that change. But I'm curious how you think about either, if you will, trends you see, or examples in terms of like how, or rather where we're going. What are some of the observations that you've made around the evolution of just the workforce and where the students of today can see themselves in 5, 10, 15 years?
So I would say a couple of things. One is I'm grateful about the pandemic, actually, because years ago, I think everyone in education thought that education would fully go remote, that kids would be on computers and they wouldn't have to go to school and they'd learn from home and I never thought that because I think learning is within a community is really valuable. Learning about myself within the relationships around me, etc., is there's not learning like that on a computer. So I'm grateful that most of us have figured out, and the conversation has died down in the education world about just learning online. There are certainly kids that will do that in their lives and do well, with that, but not the majority. And so I'm glad that's off the table. You know, that's just the pandemic helped us move that off the table. So I think that education is going to be collaborative. I think that it's going to move beyond the four walls of our schools in ways that we do this already, but I think more schools are going to be doing that. I think this mistake some schools are making right now is that they want to leap back to what they were before the pandemic, and we need to move forward. You know, we need to move into that unknown in bold ways. You know, I think that we're talking about a car, but essentially our kids are going to need to build rockets around them to you know, maybe it's an airplane first.
Listen, I'm okay with rockets. I want to be clear. My son loves rockets. Rockets are approved. Yeah, that's great.
Okay. Yeah, but I think that it's going to be faster, and we're going to have to propel more quickly. And everything we can do in early childhood education, elementary, middle, and high school to prepare kids for how fast their world is going to move, um, is going to serve them very, very well. So I used to have a professor that in education, he was way ahead of his time, and he would come in and throw what he called curves every day. Here's your class, here's what's happening. Oh, no, here's the curve that's happening. I think the entire future is in a curve for our kids. And if we are not asking ourselves those questions as educators, how do we prepare kids for the unknown? How do we prepare them to understand themselves in the world, how they communicate, how they communicate in written form and verbal form, and really deeply understand what they're thinking and perspective taking. It's kind of like malpractice if we think we can just do what we've been doing, you know, for all these years in schools. So I'm just convinced that at Inly we're going to keep propelling so that we can take these cars and make rockets.
I love this. I have to tell my son after this. I mean, again, obsessed with rockets. Rockets are life in this house right now.
Excellent, excellent.
Yeah. Yeah. So if you need a consultant, he'll show up and he'll show you how to build rockets. And it's great. Yeah.
Perfect, because you know his design will move right into the future. I'm sure. Yeah.
That's the plan. Yeah. Yep. He's going to reinvent rocketry. So, all right. So here's my last question for our conversation. This has been great. I want to give you complete creative freedom when I ask this question, and I'm sure folks want to hear it. So, what are your hopes and plans for the future? Where does this thing go? Where does Inly evolve and grow, and what does it become? I'm really curious to hear, not just tomorrow, not next week, not next year, but the big picture here.
Hmm. So I think first, foundationally, we have to just keep preparing kids the way we are and asking ourselves as educators the questions that we ask. I think because of our understanding of equity and inclusion and the future of the world, which will be much more blended than it is right now, preparing our kids to propel themselves or take that rocket, as you will, outside of the South Shore and feel confident and competent in every situation. We actually have to design a future for them that is going to give them experiences outside of the South Shore. We do that in small ways right now in internships and Model UN and travel and so on. But I think we actually have to be much more purposeful in designing and giving our kids opportunities well beyond our property. So it's nice that we've expanded, but this is, again, metaphorically, the launch pad for what I think our future of education needs to look like.
I love that. All right. So over the last 30, 35 minutes or so that we've been talking, we've heard about where it's been, where it is now, and where Inly will be in the future. Any parting advice or thoughts or ideas for I'd love to hear it for both future students and future parents. If I'm listening to this down the road, whatever format I consume it on, and I'm somebody who's considering the school, and I'm a parent or I'm a caregiver, and I really am just invested in my, my son, my daughter, my child. How do we? What are the things you want to say to them so that person that cares about their child can hear, not just with confidence but with excitement, that this is the right place, this is the right community, and the right situation for their student to flourish.
Thank you. I think we absolutely look for the better for the whole child, and essentially the head and the heart, right? But really, we want the well-being for every single child. We want them to learn deeply about themselves in the world, and sort out what their future might be and design their future, and perhaps have all of the skills to design the future, not just for themselves, but for others. Um, Design the new industries that will be invented. I don't want them to be just working in new jobs that don't exist yet. I want them to be creating those jobs. And I believe we're giving them the foundation for all of those questions and personal answers in our Inly education.
It's brilliant. Listen, this has been fantastic. I've really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you again, and I look forward to our next chat.
Thanks so much, Barrett. I've enjoyed this too. Well, have a wonderful day.
You too.